Hey guys, welcome back to ZK MasterTech. If it's your first time watching the channel, my name is Zeth. I appreciate all you guys that subscribed and hit the like button. If you go ahead and if you like my videos, go ahead and smash that like button for me. Today we have a S670. It's an older machine. I think it's a 2012, 2013. I've taken care of this machine for, I don't know, I think the past 4 or 5 years. I inspect it every year, and the customer takes very good care of this machine and has very good luck with it. He just told me last year that he went to the field and had no problems. So we're going to inspect it again this year and fix whatever it needs, and he's going to hit the field again and hopefully have no more problems. But the main things that I use to inspect a combine are pry bars. I have a smaller pry bar, a little bit bigger and longer, and then a beefy, thick snap-on bar. This thing doesn't give or bend, and I can really put a lot of pressure on bearings and pulleys and try to get stuff to move. Besides, wrenches and maybe some pliers to take chains apart and stuff, and I take all the belts off and roll them off. Don't take a whole lot of tools to actually do a combine inspection. So I always start off right here on the left side of the feeder house. I'll make my way around the machine, then we'll go up into the engine compartment, and then we'll do the grain tank, and then we'll do the unload auger, and then we'll be done. So here we got the feeder house drive chain. You can tell that it's been well lubricated. Some guys lube them, some guys don't. If you do oil them, I think it does make the chain last a little longer. Got 2 master links here, so we know we could shorten this chain if the customer wanted to. A lot of the times when we're running large heads, 35-foot drapers, 12-row corn heads, generally we're replacing this chain yearly. It just gets a lot of wear on it, and the farmer usually just wants to replace it every year. But just looking at this chain, we do have a little bit of adjustment left here. We can loosen this and shove this forward. We could also take a link out of this chain to get some of the slack out of it. So I'm gonna look at the guides. You got these plastic guides, make sure it's not worn through into the metal. That looks good. I'll lift up on this back shaft bearing. It's good. I checked the tone wheel. I'm also going to visually inspect the sensor for the contour master, the back shaft speed sensor, and I'm going to check the wiring. Make sure it's not pinched off or been hit, ripped up. It goes on back here, and then there's a connector in here, and then I notice it's floppy. It's supposed to be attached back here, so maybe we can get that secured back to where that isn't rattling around. This is the AC drain tube. We'll make sure that mice haven't eaten a hole in any of that, and that it's attached down here and not flopping around. And you want to make sure that it's got this little, it's kind of like a check valve at the end of it, and that's good. I'll visually inspect the lift cylinder. Make sure it's not leaking. There's no scarring or pitting on the chrome of the rod. That looks good. Then I'll move over to here. I'll check my feed accelerator belt. Take the tension off of it. I'll take the belt off, and then I'm gonna turn it by hand and check it. Make sure there's no cracks or splitting in it, any holes through the backing. And it looks good. I'll spin the idlers, make sure the bearings in the idlers here are good. I'll spin the feed accelerator, listen to the bearings. They don't make any noise. Then if we want to further check that feed accelerator bearing, we put a pry bar on it. So we're sticking a bar through the hole in the pulley, grabbing the top of the bearing housing, and we're trying to pick up on it right there. Now, if that bearing was loose, we'd be clunking up and down, and it's good. And we check and make sure that you got a grease circ here at 6 o'clock down in here. Make sure it's not broke off and that it's there, and a guy can go ahead and shoot some grease in it and make sure the bearing takes grease properly. Up here, we got 2 more grease circs. That grease circ there goes to the rotor bearing, and then that grease circ up here goes to the primary countershaft bearing, and those are 400-hour grease circs that you're supposed to hit. And then I kind of peek over here, look at this bearing. We'll check more into that later, but I just kind of lay some eyes on it. Slip clutch for the shoe drive. We look at our axle shafts. Make sure the pinion doesn't have any movement in the final drive. Make sure all the clips and everything are all in place. That all looks good. And then we'll take this plug out of the final drive and check the oil. So if you take a 9/16 triple square socket, you can get onto these square plugs. Pop these out. We should have some oil come out. We want to change the oil on these final drives every 1,500 hours. Yeah, it's got oil. And I think the customer changed them last year. And we tighten it back up. And then we check the other side. And we also check the feeder house conveyor chain tensioner. Make sure the spring is not broke. We can tell it needs to be adjusted a little bit. The front edge of this washer, when I start the season, I like to be right at the beginning of this notch. Also, when you look at the slot here, in a perfect world, we want to be right in the middle, or maybe a little more towards this area. Once she starts going forward, we know that chain is starting to stretch. So this one's a little bit forward, but it might not be enough to take a half link out and still be able to get it back in. And we'll just have to look at that a little further and see. But this eye bolt and this spring, there's one on each side of the feeder house, and that's what's keeping tension on this conveyor chain. And it's pushing this drum forward to put pressure on this chain. This will give you a closer look at this cylinder. Look at the pin, make sure the pin's in place. Make sure it's got a cotter pin. Look at the cylinder, make sure it's not leaking. Now we're gonna get into checking the shoe augers. We're gonna drop this door down and check the underneath side of the feeder house. And then back here we have our feeder house slip clutch. And it's been changed before, because I think the original ones are black, and when you get a new one, they're green. And she's got a couple grease circs on it that's supposed to be greased, but you don't want to grease them, over grease them, because if you over grease them, they'll slip too easily. So you want to grease them to you just barely start seeing grease coming out here. You don't want to force a whole bunch of grease out of it. Okay, and then we can check and feel with a pry bar that it doesn't have any movement. All right, so this is the underneath side of the feeder house. We can look at our sprockets, make sure that the teeth on the sprockets aren't getting hooked. And these have been recently replaced, so they look pretty good. And then we'll go ahead and spin this feed accelerator around. Can you spin that pulley? And then we're gonna look at a little slower. I'm gonna look at all the teeth, all the wear bars, the supports, make sure this thing hasn't eaten a rock and broke anything, dented anything. looks to be good. We check those wear strips whenever it wears down to where it's halfway. Hold on a second. I don't know if I can point it out, but these teeth, whenever it gets tapered down to about halfway across the strip, then we'll want to go ahead and rotate these bars over and then run them another year. And then it's kind of hard to show on camera, but up in there where the chain comes up over the sprocket, I'm going to check the wear strips by hand real quick, but we'll get a closer look at them when I take the top door off. We dropped the feeder house down, and we're taking this upper door off. And one thing you want to check is make sure this rubber seal here, there's no holes in it. Mice like to chew holes in through right here and get inside there, and then you'd be leaking debris and crop out of this hole here. But this one seems to be pretty solid. And here we can get a closer look at our mid-floor wear strips. We're about halfway through, 3/4 maybe. We'll probably change those out. Also, you look up in here, you can just barely see it, but you can see the rotor bearing up in here. I'm looking to make sure like the seal on it's not popped out or anything. It's kind of hard to check the up and down movement of the rotor bearing, but if that bearing goes out, you can feel it whenever you're running the combine. And I can also feel it when I'm rotating the rotor over and everything's smooth. I got this door flip back up, but we want to inspect the hinge on this door. And when grain and material is running over the top of it, it can eventually wear that hinge out and wear flat spots in it, and it can wear through the metal where that hinge starts coming apart. And this one actually did that. That's why it's still got stickers on. It's new because it's just been replaced. So in here we got the stone trap. So what that's designed to do is to catch stones and rocks and other heavy objects will drop down there instead of feeding into the feed accelerator up into there. And it's really important at the end of the day for the farmer to drop this door down and clean it out, because eventually it'll get filled full of cobs or beans and dirt and whatnot, and then this whole cavity will filled full. So then if a rock comes into the machine, guess what? It hits the top of that material and goes right into the feed accelerator. So we want to keep this emptied out every day. Then on where this door latches together, we want to make sure we don't have any big gaps here, and that we're got a good seal in here so we're not leaking grain out, and that we got no holes in this piece or in the rest of the floor of the feeder house. So give that a good check over, make sure you don't have any holes worn through, because eventually you can wear holes through the bottom of the feeder house. We look at the cooler for the reverser, make sure we don't have any leaks. Hoses look good. We look at our stop for our other cylinder, make sure that it's able to be held into place so we don't damage the other lift cylinder. And then we'll take a peek right in there where that shaft goes in the reverser and make sure that it's not leaking on the O-ring on that back shaft. So I went ahead and took the chain off so we can inspect these sprockets here, give them a spin, move them around, make sure that they're good, not noisy. We can also check this back shaft bearing a little better with no chain tension on it, lift up and down on it. Check the tone wheel, and then you want this to be able to move, because you can move this collar and then pull this out, because we can run 2 different chain speeds. And normally we run on the smaller sprocket. Most guys don't use this other sprocket, we usually use this one here, but that allows them to move the sprockets from one to the other. But you want to make sure this is freed up and it's able to move back and forth, and you usually got to spray some penetrant in there and work it back and forth to get that broke free. And then we're also wanting to look at this pivot down here where it locks the feeder house into position. This washer's got teeth on it that engage into this guy here, and I've seen this be broken or missing if they hit something really hard on the feeder house, you can break this down here. So we want to check that. Make sure this pivot all looks good. And we also want to grab the feeder house, shake it back and forth, make sure that there's no excessive movement back and forth, because there's plastic plates back behind here, poly plates, for it to be able to move on for the contour master back and forth. And we want to make sure we don't have any slop in the plate. I also want to check these pivots here, our little turnbuckle rod that changes the angle on the feeder house. The newer ones, of course, have hydraulic fore and aft to hydraulically control the angle of the feeder house plate. This one's manual setup, so you have to manually set this up in the field whenever you put a header on it, but we just want to make sure that everything's in place. Now that we got the chain off, we can go ahead and rotate the conveyor chain by hand, and we'll rotate it all the way around and check all the links. We're looking for, excess stretching, gapping in the chain. We're looking for wear on these rollers. Looking to make sure all these bolts are in place, and we're checking the condition of these bars. But this type of bar is pretty much indestructible. If you break one of these, you did something. Usually the chain or the attaching hardware will break before one of these do. And then we look inside here, check the inside of these drum plates and check the bearings on it. Of course, we inspect the floor, make sure there's no holes. And generally, where you'll start to develop some holes in the feeder house is right here, right on this edge. And if you run this feeder house drum in the low position, like if you're running crops like corn or soybeans, we generally like to run this drum in the up position, because you're gonna shove a massive amount of material in here and that drum's just gonna raise up anyway. And so if you have it in the low position, the drum will raise up, and then when the material kind of clears out, it'll slam back down, and it wears out the drum adjustment over here, which it sits on a cam that you can adjust the height here. Either if the handle's straight up, it's up. Over here, it's down. But in our conditions in Illinois, the amount of crop what we flow inside these feeder houses, we leave them up. And it also kind of saves on the floor, puts less pressure on the floor. And this one looks pretty good. So here we have the reverser gear case. This is a variable speed drive, high torque reverser. And what we're going to do is try to pry on this sheave here, and we're checking the cams in here, and what we're looking for is excess movement between the left side and the right side. We want that to move pretty much together. And it's kind of hard to tell with this amount of spring pressure on it, but you can get enough movement with a pry bar to make you want to think that you're going to go ahead and take the spring pressure off and further inspect the wear on the cams on this guy. And then we're also looking for excessive grease leakage around in here, or inside the sheaves here. We definitely don't want grease leaking out here. It's not as bad if it leaks out here. It'll actually come out here if you put enough grease in it and you run the speed up and down, it'll actually squirt out in here, which that's a good thing. And when you rotate this around, you got 2 grease pumps, and you rotate them to where they're 12 and 2, and then you're going to put 12 pumps in this one and 2 pumps in this one twice a day, once in the beginning of the day, once towards the end of the day. And when you put too much grease in here, it'll end up squirting out here, which is fine. But if you put too many pumps into this one, it'll come out here, and then you'll get grease on the belt, and then this thing will slip, and that pretty much shuts you down. And then you also have 2 more grease zerks on the back side of this upper variable sheave, and you want to give them, a good 5 pumps in each one of those twice a day. But you can over grease that. You get too much grease in there, you'll actually pop out the grease seal inside of here, because these sheaves have to move. Well, this sheave here moves back and forth, and if there's too much grease inside that cavity, it'll hydraulically push that grease seal out. And then we're gonna go ahead and you gotta drop the feeder house drum down in order to pull this dipstick out, and we're gonna check the gear oil level inside of this gear case. So pull the dipstick out, check the oil level on it. And it's good. One thing, these dipsticks can break off and fall down inside of the reverser gear case. I've seen that happen a couple times. So then the reverser is good. This one, the vent adapter likes to spin when we try to take this off. So we're gonna go ahead and try to tighten this nut down here tight enough to where this whole thing doesn't want to spin, just try to get the dipstick out. So we'll fix that. This reverser has a vent kit on it, so it's got a hose that's remotely mounted up to here to keep oil from coming out of the dipstick. When it had an old dipstick, it'd have a little rattle cap on top of here, and when guys would park the combines and leave the head down, and then all the oil from the oil cooler would come down and overfill the gear case, and then they would take off in the field and run, and then we'd get oil coming out of the vent. So we put this vent kit on to where mounts the high point up here to where we don't lose any oil whenever, you know, the head's laid down and we got more oil in this gear case to keep it from leaking so much. And then we check our multi-coupler up here, make sure that it latches and that these pins come out on both sides. And it's really important to make sure that when we retract it, that the pins are going all the way in flush. We don't want them sticking out any, because then it'll bind up on the header. It'll be hard to install and remove our header. And we want to make sure there's a little screw here. This is actually a shear pin, so if something's bound up, when you move this handle, it'll actually shear this little pin. And there's should be some extra ones. Yeah, we got extra ones here. So we want to make sure that they don't have none there. You want to make sure you have like 3 of them in there, because they could possibly break them in the field and they need extras in order to get that to work. And then we check the electrical connector, make sure there's no backed out pins or any damage in the plastic, which this one's got some wear on it, some cracking, but I don't think it's going to cause an issue yet. And then we can push in these couplers and make sure that they don't stick or leak any oil. And this belt is set up almost perfectly. You can see that there's not a big hump right here. You don't want to run this pulley all the way up to where you have a big hump, because then you lose traction down here, because the higher you raise this belt, the more it comes up out of this pulley and the less traction you have on this variable shift. Now, yeah, if it's the last day and you're trying to wrap things up and you need a little bit more speed, it'll probably be okay to bump it up here a little bit to get you through the day. But starting the season, we want to start like this, and on S-Series we want our speed to be between 500 and 520, and 490 is our low end spec. And then we come back here, we check this top bracket, make sure there's no cracking anywhere in here like it likes to crack. And this one's had an updated bracket on it to where this welded gusset is a little taller and has more weld on it. And then we check our feeder house position sensor bracket here, make sure none of these nuts are loose. We check the linkage on it, make sure that it's good and tight. Check our sensor. And when we ran the machine, we could tell that this was working. Check the wiring. While I'm down here, kind of look for leaks on any of these hoses down in here. And we could go ahead and take these shields off and look a little further into here. Now we got the shields off the upper variable shifts to where we can visually inspect this bearing, make sure the seal's good, it's not slinging grease out here. Look at the piston, inspect this hose, look inside here, check the grease seal, check this bracket here, really good for cracks, any excessive heat or black marks here for maybe it's caught on fire behind this bearing or anything like that. The thing spins over really good. I don't feel anything. When we come back here, I took a pry bar, stuck underneath here and lifted up on this. It felt good on this. Is a feed accelerator. This is the other side of the bearing. And we check our belt adjustment here. Of course, we spin this belt over and make sure that there's no splits in it. This is our wheel pump. We check the bearings on the pulley. You stick a bar right here, press up and down on it, make sure that pulley doesn't wiggle up and down. One thing you want to check that a lot of people miss is this cotter pin right here. This cotter pin can get wore and it'll break, and this tensioner arm that's spring loaded will come off, and then this belt will go flying off. So make sure this cotter pin's in good condition. Sometimes you can loosen the belt up and you can push this over a little more, and you can add more washers onto it to pick up some of the slack, and then put a new cotter pin in it to get it to last longer. And we check up here on our reel valve block, make sure there's no leaks. All the electrical connections look good up there. Also, we want to check the wheels and the rims, spacer, wheel bolts, make sure there's no cracking or anything coming loose on the duals. Make sure none of the bolts are coming loose and there's no cracks around the wheel. And we're going to come over here and we're going to climb up and inspect that primary countershaft gear case, the clutch. So you want to shake that clutch back and forth and make sure that there's no looseness on this nut, or you'll see it in the washer behind the nut. The tapered shaft that's behind there can wear and it cause excessive amount of movement in the clutch, and then you'll get vibration in this gear case, which can cause the mounts to break. It can cause the dipstick tube to break off. Right now we're checking the oil on the gear case, make sure it's good and the the tube's not broke or cracked or anything. And the clutch was good and tight. How's the oil level look? Good. And then we'll check the U-joints on this primary shaft, universal shaft that goes all the way back to the engine gear case. And we're going to inspect this frame rail for any cracking. Now we're in the concave area where the threshing happens, with the rotor and the threshing elements. We're going to inspect the Z-bar, the concave Z-bar here. We're going to check the gussets in this plate, make sure there are no welds breaking or cracking in this plate. It's recently been leveled last year, so I know that's good. It's good to re-level these every 1,000 hours, because as components wear, you're going to need to bring the concave in more to have more correct zero. Because if this concave isn't mechanically zeroed, it's one of the most important adjustments on the machine to make sure that your concave is technically zeroed. Because if this is out of whack, it's going to affect the rest of the machine. We want to make sure that this is adjusted correctly. So now we're checking in here. We looked over the concaves. This is round bar concave. Make sure none of the bars are bent or any of the welds are broken. That all looked good. We came down here. We got a shoe auger. The front bearing is a little loose. We're going to fix that. But another thing we found that I hate to see, but this bulkhead, this plate, the shoe auger bulkhead, or backing plate is another word for it, it's cracked. And what you can see of the crack, it goes from like here and goes straight down. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but there's that crack. And in my experience, if you weld that crack, it makes the metal more brittle and you're not actually fixing the problem. Because right there where that crack is, on the other side of it is a bearing holder that it's welded to that backing plate. And for some reason, that shaft when it's turning, it's allowing that bearing holder to flex back and forth, and that's what cracks out that plate. And if you go in and weld that, it makes that metal harder and it allows it to break even worse. But you're not welding the entire crack unless you take this shoe auger trough completely out, because in my experience, that crack goes farther down, probably 4 or 5 inches down, and curves around usually. So you're not even welding the whole crack, you're just welding what you can see. But what will eventually happen is this will get worse enough to where this plate will start chunking out and breaking, and then you'll have a hole here and grain will leak out and go into the transmission area, and you'll be leaking corn or beans or whatever out this hole. So we'll talk with the farmer and see if he wants to fix this or not, but it's a big job. The job code for it's 33 hours of labor. A couple guys can do it in a day, but it's quite a bit of work because you got to take all the shoe augers out, you got to take the concaves out, you got to get underneath the combine, take the drive shaft out for the shoe augers, and then you got to take the shoe auger trough, pull it back and out, and then you got to cut this plate in half and pull it out. You got to modify the side of the combine here, cut out a little triangle down here so the new backing plate can get shoved in here, slid down, snapped into place, and then you bolt it into place, and then you got to put your drive shaft and all your shoe augers back together. So it's a big job, and you're working in an uncomfortable space, especially when you're underneath the machine getting all the drive shaft components undone. But a lot of times if it's just cracked like that, we'll just go ahead and run it and just see what happens. Sometimes the farmers want to go ahead and fix it, sometimes they just want to wait and hold off, but I don't recommend welding those cracks, because I've had them welded before, or I welded them and then they ended up breaking worse because we didn't actually fix the problem of why it broke in the first place. And it'll actually break on the other side of the combine too, because there's another bearing carrier. It'll crack over on that side too. So we'll check that other side and see if it's cracked as well. And if it's busted or cracked really bad too, then that kind of might make our decision not whether we want to replace this backing plate or not. And then we check the rear bearings on the shoe augers. Here, look at these. It's got quite a bit of backlash in the bevel gears on the front of the shoe augers. And then we can come back here and we kind of visually inspect our pre-chaffer area in here. Alright, come up here. We took the unload chain off. We just kind of spin all the sprockets, feel them. Feels a little bit rough. This one. That one doesn't sound too good. We're gonna write that one down, replace it. That sounds pretty decent. Oh yeah, got a bunch of backlash from play in the vertical. When we were in this combine, vertical was really noisy. I take 2 bars, I stick them into here, and I pry this back and forth, and you can see how much movement there is. And that nut's loose, this gear's loose, and that's just way too much backlash. You can see the excessive wear on the bevel gears. And this movement here is most likely it's loose on the shaft, but also the bearing that's inside of this housing is wallered into the housing. So we're gonna have to drop this whole vertical gear case down, replace the housing, put all new bearings and shaft and gears in it in order to fix that. So here we inspect the cleaning fan, look at all the fins, make sure none of the fins are broken coming out of the holders. We check the bearing, it's good and tight. Check the tone wheel, check the sensor. Come over here, check these are the pitman arms. This is our chaffer arm, our sieve arm. And we're just gonna pry back here. We'll check the shaft bearing and check the pitman bearings. Check the clean auger bearing here. That's good. We'll pry on these arms, make sure there's no cracking in the rubber, especially right here where this arm attaches to it. Looking for cracking in the rubber and the bushing in here or in here, or on the sieve arm down in here. And that goes for all the swing arms and shake arms on the machine. We'll pry on them, make sure the bushings aren't loose. We don't have any excess movement anywhere. This one's been pipped where it's had the extra bracket added onto here to where we actually attach to the chaffer frame in 3 bolts instead of just 1 to try to prevent the chaffer frame from cracking. Here we're checking the swing arms on the back, making sure there's no excess movement in the bushings on them. So that top one's for our return pan. This one's for the chaffer, and this one down here is for the sieve. And we're also checking the distance between the seal and the side frame, the side sheet, to make sure it's not super tight on one side versus the other side of the combine. And we checked it, it's a little biased to the right, but it's not out of spec in my opinion. So I think it'll be just fine. And then up here, we'll go ahead and take this discharge beater pulley, the belt off the pulley. We'll spin all that, check the belt. And then we're also going to put the rotor in neutral, and we're gonna spin this rotor. I usually stick a small pry bar through to grab it, and I just turn it with a pry bar. A guy can take one of these separator grates to maybe get a better look inside, and you can see better with the grate removed, but you can see fairly decently with the grates in place and turning it with a pry bar. And that's what we're going to do today. Kind of rushed on time on this job, so we'll go ahead and rotate it. We'll make sure all the separator tines are in good shape and not broken off, that there's no holes in the rotor, and then we'll look and see the condition of the threshing elements as well. And there are wear specs on these separator tines, but they run a really long time. I think there's a spec in the book of how long they should be, and also there's some holes on the threshing element here. When that hole starts getting elongated, more like an oval shape, the more it gets like an oval shape, the more wear that threshing element has. And then we're also looking for cracks or breaks in the threshing elements. But these things are harder than woodpecker lips, and they generally last a really long time unless you try to eat a rock or something like that, and then you could have some damage on them. And then we'll look in here and we'll check the rotor flighting, make sure that it's in good shape too. So we checked the rotor and it's all good. These are Estes disruptors that they have added. They no longer make those anymore. And a lot of the times it'll break this one and this one off and it's broken, but they're still in there. You can just leave them in there and that's fine, just as long as it didn't bust the separator grate. It'll be okay. I normally just leave those in. And up here, we make sure our rotor shifted into neutral okay, and it did, and we were able to rotate it over. And then we look up here at the rotor hydraulic union, right here, and it looks like it's been seeping a little bit, but it's not super wet. I checked to see if it was loose, but it's not as tight. Little seepage around the cylinder, but nothing too terrible. It's not wet, it's dry. I think we're gonna let that be. We'll let the customer know about it and let him decide whether he wants to change it or not, but nothing's wet. Up here, we'll check the jack shaft bearings for the unload auger drive. Push up on that shaft and look at those bearings. We can also spin this pulley. And right now we're taking off the discharge beater belt. So we can spin the discharge beater, listen to the bearings, pry up on this shaft here, check the belt condition. We'll look in here, look at the rotor belt, make sure it doesn't have any splits in it or cracking. And then we'll look and make sure nothing's leaking grease anywhere in here. And there's another sheave in here, which is called the torque sensing unit. And we'll check the sheave play in there once we get up top. Then we'll inspect our hydraulic valve block here, make sure there's no leaks. Sometimes these little plugs will back out and leak in here. Inspect our header control valve, make sure that's all good, no leaks. I did check this. This is the left-hand tailing auger bearing, and it's got a little play in it, so I think we're going to change that out. So we took this discharge beater belt off and we spun it and checked the shaft bearing on it, and it was all good. Now we're going to get up here, check the unload drive belts, the tensioner pulley, the cylinder. We'll look at this black air tube that shoots air from the engine fan into our after treatment enclosure to make sure it's pressurized with air so we don't get chaff built up in there to keep fires down. We loosen the upper chopper belt or chopper jack shaft belt, whatever you want to call it, to check these pulleys to make sure the bearings on them were good. Spun the belt, it was good. Came down here to the chopper drive and spun these around and found pretty good split in the belt on the outer one, so that's going to get changed. We'll check the bearings in here on this jack shaft, make sure that they're good and solid. We'll look up in here, our hydraulic pumps, make sure there's no leaks on the bottom of the hydraulic reservoir. These are our pumps. We'll look over the hydro real well. Looks like it's been seeping something. This is our charge filter. We'll look at it. And we'll inspect more of this when we get to the top side of the engine compartment. Then come around here. We'll check these axle bolts, make sure that the axle housing does not have any cracks or these bolts are coming loose. I've seen these bolts break and this axle housing can get broken and cracked, and especially down in here. We'll check over the spindle, the wheel bearing for the rear, the wiring for the rear axle position sensor, and we're also going to look at the steering tie rod end. We'll make sure all these switches work for the sieve and the chaffer. This raises the chopper up and down, and then we'll make sure that our lights are working. This is inside of the shoe, and this is the lights on the gullwing door. We got one on. That one doesn't work. That one doesn't work. So we're going to inspect our top side of our chopper here and our manual vane tailboard. We'll make sure all the vanes are there and not damaged. And I noticed we got some bolts missing on the upper chopper door, but that's no big deal. We can put those in. The knockout holes have already been covered up, so it's not leaking residue on top of the tailboard. We also have a aftermarket trash tube put on there that better directs the airflow across this tailboard to keep chaff from building up on top here when you're running. You can get that at Sloan's Express. Everything seems to be good here. All right, we're gonna go ahead and raise the chopper up and inspect it. We'll go in here and check the chopper hammers. They got some wear on them, getting rounded off on the edges here. Now, if those get too dull, it'll actually rob horsepower, because it takes a lot more force to cut through the material and try to get it out of the chopper. Whether those blades are sharper, it'll cut through it and get rid of it faster. But we want to make sure we don't have excess movement in the bushings. I mean, this is pretty typical, but we don't want any like super loose bushings, to make sure none of them are broken or missing. And then we'll also check the stationary knives down here, make sure that they're in good shape. These look like they got some pretty good wear on the backside, and they've already been flipped. Further inspecting for holes in the lower chopper floor. Found some big gaping holes there, so we might need to address that. Okay, we got the chopper opened up. Got a little owie here on the end of the chopper tailboard, but we're not going to worry about that. Long way away from its heart. Check our loss monitors, so whenever corn drops down through those holes, ticks on these pads, and the loss monitor is counting those amount of hits and lets you know if you're losing corn out the back, which we don't want. So that's what those are for. You want to check this seal here, make sure all these rivets are in place, because those like to fall out and be missing. Inside here, let's get some light on the situation. We're going to inspect our chaffer frame, our springs, hold down bolts. We're going to look at all the louvers, make sure there's none bent, broken, or missing. Maybe we got something going on back there. Looks like one's hanging down, possibly. We got definite crackage there on the chaffer frame. Well, this is what we'd call the chaffer element that sits in the chaffer frame. But right here you can see it's broken. And then we'll look down through the fins the best we can and inspect the sieve screen and its louvers. And then we'll look up in here, check all your pre-chaffer area, looking for cracks or any problems with the chaffer frame or the sieve frame itself. Looking down through here, I know it's hard to see on camera, but we'll also check this return pin right here, make sure that it looks good. We'll check this is the discharge beater concave, make sure that no rocks have been through there and broke any of the grates out or bent them down. We'll check the discharge beater bars, and this one's got quite a significant amount of wear right here on the bars, which is where a lot of the material goes through, because it's thicker towards the end, so we might think about replacing those bars. So moving to the right side, we got the vacuum fan assembly. We're going to check the dry belt and the idlers on it. And of course we check the swing arms on this side, the right side of the machine. We'll check that discharge beater bearing on this right side. And then I did hear some squeaking up in the engine compartment, and I think it's coming from the rotary screen jackshaft tensioner pulley. I think we're gonna have to take that belt off and take a closer look with that. But I went ahead and I took this battery cover off and looked at the batteries and make sure there wasn't any corrosion or any loose connections inside of there. Make sure our battery switch feels good. Then we're gonna check all our power connections here. It's important to check all the machine grounds really. I might have missed that on the other side of the combine, but I always try to wiggle these wires up in here and make sure our grounds are good, because a lot of the electrical problems in the field I see is when those grounds come loose. And then we'll check all this wiring, make sure that's all good. And then way up here, I think our squeak is coming from this rotary screen jack shaft, which is taking, there's a belt going to the engine crankshaft, which turns this guy, which turns a giant rotary screen in front of our coolers. I think the squeak's coming from up there. So up here we got this big rotary screen, and this is keeping dirt from getting into our coolers. This thing's spinning to help keep dirt and debris from getting into our coolers, but it's got a jack shaft that I pointed to earlier, and here it comes out the other side. And when we spin this, the bearings are just rougher than a cob. So I think that's what our noise was. So we'll get bearings for it. And I checked the other pulleys for the rotary screen, and the belt looks like it's in good shape. So we know we gotta recondition that jack shaft for sure. So we're gonna pop open the rotary screen door. These clips. Here we got our charge air cooler, hydraulic cooler, radiator down here. One thing, we want to make sure that this propeller doesn't have a whole lot of play and that it spins freely. What that propeller does is kind of pulsates the air, so it'll kind of work the dirt through the coolers with that pulsation of air. We've got our coolers on the side here too. So now we're going to check the elevators on this machine, and a quick way to do this is to come up here and pop your rear countershaft belt off the pulley, and then you can run a ratchet on your tailings slip clutch, your elevator slip clutch here, and you can just ratchet this and both elevators will turn over. If you got another guy handy, you can have one guy do this while another guy is looking down here at the paddles. Let's come down to the tailings, and he's going to spin it, and we're going to look at every link and every paddle in this tailings chain. Here's got the clean grain elevator. We'll inspect the auger. Feels okay. We'll check the sprocket. We're going to rotate the elevator over, and we'll make sure that all the S-hooks or cotter pins for the chain is in place. And then we'll also check up in here. There's a divider in this elevator and make sure there's no cracks or any problems up in there. So we checked the elevator chains and they were good. While I was turning this over, I inspected the belt on the clean grain elevator and the tailings. This chain needs adjusted. You want to make sure the sprocket in here that this chain rides on is tight on the shaft. Sometimes they can work loose. We're going to go ahead and we'll check the clean fan variable belt. Check the shoe drive belt here. Check the pitman bearings and the shaft bearing. We'll go up here, we'll check the front countershaft belts. We'll check this rear countershaft belt as well. We've already got it loose, so we can spin that around pretty easily. We'll come in here, inspect our concaves on this side. Make sure this, where this concave mounts on this rod here, we don't have any cracking or failures on that bracket that holds the main rod up here. That all looks good. We're looking at the separator frame rail. We check the hoods on both sides that'll go over the rotor, make sure there's no holes or damage on those. Then we're gonna look in here. See, right now there's dirt right where I want to check where cracking happens on that bulkhead. So I'm gonna get that removed and see if we got any damage there. And then we'll check the shoe auger bearings, front ones and the rear on this side. And then we got a right hand counter shaft. We'll check the bearings on it. And of course we already checked this feed accelerator belt that's loose hanging out there. And we'll check the bearing and the slip clutch on the shoe drive shaft. We'll check the slip clutch on the fan. Check the bearing. Check the fins, make sure there's no damage on them anywhere. Make sure the fan is centered in the machine. Check this actuator here. This is what's moving our cleaning fan adjustment. And you want to make sure that these threads are good and clean, so this little motor's got to be able to run this shaft right here and run this back and forth real easily. If these threads get galled up or get a bunch of dirt or something packed in them, it has a real hard time working that back and forth. Right now, we got a guy underneath and he's checking the shoe auger drive shaft and the bevel gears back in here. We're checking to see if they're loose on the shaft. We're checking the backlash on the gears, looking at the gear condition, checking the front bearings, the pins holding the gears onto the axle, or the shoe auger. I can't even talk. It's too hot. This combine's got a 3-speed push button shift transmission, so we're going to check the gear oil on the right side towards the front. The transmission, we got a square plug here. Pull that plug out, make sure she's got good oil level. Okay, up here on top, the engine compartment, we're going to check the coolant level through here. And she's good and full. Check the hydraulic reservoir level. We're good, and you normally want to check this with the head all the way down. So the head's up right now, so if I know if it went down, we'd have plenty of oil in it. Of course, you want to check your air filters. We're gonna flip this slider up out of the way and check the engine oil level and check the engine over. So here we got the John Deere Interim Tier 4 9-liter engine. And we're going to check the oil, look for leaks, stuff like that. We'll look on both sides of the engine, check it all over real good. Look at the wiring, the sensors, turbo, all that. So here we're checking the main engine gear case oil level. Wipe it off, set her back in, and check it again. Right on the money. All right, now I'm in the inside of the unload auger boot. Check the grain saver door, make sure it works, and then I'm gonna check the flighting, see how sharp it is on the end of the auger. So up here we got the unload auger swung out. We're inspecting the inner horizontal auger and looking down inside here and checking the vertical. Spinning this back and forth, trying to feel the movement between the horizontal and the vertical. And I'm checking the spline wear on the shafts of the 90-degree gear case that's inside here. And they should spin together, have very little slop, but this one's got quite a bit of slop in between the two augers, so we might have to look more into that. All right, we got the second door open. Looking in here, got a little bit of slop in between the two augers, but that inner auger's getting pretty sharp out on the end. So we're sharp on the inner and sharp on the outer. Well, I had to pull the combine outside. As you can see, we had a little clearance issue in the shed to get this engine door up, but I got it outside and we'll look over everything. I put a new EGR cooler and pipe on it, I think last year. I want to make sure this is the black pipe I talked about earlier that's feeding air pressure into the after treatment enclosure. You can see how it's just a big box that's feeding air from this fan blowing into this tube here. And we'll get down there and we'll check the variable speed fan drive on here. Make sure the belt looks good on there. We're not leaking grease anywhere. And we'll just look over both sides of the engine, make sure we don't have any leaks. No broken wires, no broken connectors. We'll check all the charge air lines, all the radiator hoses and clamps, and all that stuff. We'll check the turbos over. One thing you want to check these exhaust pipes. This flex joint, make sure nothing's broke or cracked. Check it down in here before it goes into the after treatment enclosure. Make sure the pipe's not cracked or broken, or we got excess soot built up in here, because I've seen these pipes crack before. We want to crawl into here, back behind the engine. We got the torque sensing unit on the rotor, and he's pulling the dipstick out on this rotor 2-speed gear case, and we're going to check the oil level on it. Here's the cornfields of Central Illinois on a nice hot August day. Now we're going to go into the grain tank. First thing I like to do is check the gear case oil on the loading auger here. Just got a plastic little dipstick that you spin out, check, and it's got gear oil. First look at this fountain auger, I noticed we got a bolt missing here on this bearing carrier. This one has had a poly liner installed, so if you start getting some delamination or starting to get some wear on your fountain auger tube, you can install these poly liners you can get from Sloan's Express in here to get a little bit more life out of your tube. It's getting some wear on this auger, but I think she's going to be all right. Getting a little bit of delamination in here, but it's still pretty thick. Unlatch the tube, drop her down. All right, come in here and I'm going to check the gear case, wiggle that shaft back and forth. Make sure it's good and tight while you feel this backlash. Now the driver teeth are starting to get a little hooked. It's not horrendous. They give you 4 because you have 2 on your auger, and that allows you to run on 2 for a while, and then you can switch and run on the other 2. So, and we got quite a bit of wear here on these, but it'll run. So I think we want to run on these 2 because it's a little thinner over here. Run on this one for another year, and then we'll check mass flow sensor plate here. Check this poly in here, make sure it's not coming apart. And then we'll look inside the elevator. We're going to check our top sprocket. And down there, there's like a poly plate. We want to make sure that's in place. That can sometimes fall out of these elevators. And we'll look at this divider in here, make sure nothing's bowed out or bent. And we'll look inside the housing, make sure there's no holes wore through the housing, and then we'll check the bearings back here. And then start checking the Check these cross augers, check the condition of the flighting on those. You want to check the glass and the seal behind the glass. That light's a little, bracket's bent, but I think it'll be all right. But yeah, we're just kind of looking for holes or excess wear in the grain tank. Sometimes older combines, the liners in the grain tank can get wore and you'll start wearing through. But this one's still got plenty of steel left in her. So I think we got the combine inspection wrapped up. Hopefully that gives you guys a better idea of what it takes to actually inspect an S-Series Combine, what all goes into it. I know I might have missed some things on camera, but rest assured I did check it. It was kind of hard to film everything because there's just a ton of stuff to check on these machines. So I think we got this thing figured out. I'm gonna go back to the shop and we'll create an estimate. And let me know how I did on the inspection, if there's anything extra that you guys might check or that I might not know about. I'm always open ears to hear if there's any more issues with these combines that need to keep an eye out for. So just give me a shout out on the comments. If you like this video, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll check you guys later. And I don't know, maybe we might do a video on repairing this combine and maybe do another inspection on an 8-class machine, because that's a completely different animal. But thanks for watching.